Well, this is the last of the video lessons for Chapter 6. It covers the other section of animals. So far we've talked about the first 8 phyla that we're covering. This one covers phylum Chordata and spends most of its time talking about the vertebrates. So in order to summarize some notes for this, it would be really helpful if you have your chart, the summary chart or the survey for the classes of vertebrates. So this is what it looks like. Okay, and as we go through each class, you can jot down some of the things. And of course, since we're looking at them, there are a few extra terms and things that may not be on the slides, but that will come up as we talk about the different structures and different features of them during the dissections. Okay, so we will talk about this in class and the kind of things that you should have down in case there's anything that you're missing or need to add. We may go through the first one together once we're done with that class. Okay, so this is the last of section 6.3. Like we've said earlier, the vertebrates make up only about 5% of the animal kingdom, but yet they're the ones that we tend to think of when we're little and we're growing up and we're learning about animals. So it included in phylum Chordata is the name of the phylum that we belong to and that other chordates or other vertebrates belong to. So the features that all chordates have, in terms of the different things that we've been looking at for each phylum, they are all bilateral in terms of their symmetry. They're triploblastic, so they have 3 germ layers, which differentiate into much more complex tissues and systems. They are coelomate, meaning they have the true body cavity. So if you were to open up our body, we have a cavity that a lot of our organs sit in. It's our abdominal cavity, and inside of it we have the part of our digestive tract. So we have our intestines, we have our stomach, we have our spleen and our gallbladder and liver and kidneys. All those things are in our body cavity, but they're all covered by, and the inside of the body wall is covered by special tissue, special membrane. In us it's called the peritoneum, or peritoneum, some say, and that is what makes it a true body cavity. So we're considered coelomate. We have a complete digestive tract. So we have both a mouth and an anus, and the food usually goes in one direction. At time, if you're sick, then your body's mechanism to try and get rid of that is to throw it up or to have it go out quickly the other way. So most live on land, and there are fewer chordate species than invertebrate species, but like we said, it seems like there's more because they're larger and we see them more often. The other 3 things that make chordates, not other animal phyla, are the fact that they have a dorsal nerve cord. So ours is our spinal cord, okay, and it has nerves that branch to all different parts of the body, and at one part it becomes the brain. Okay, so our dorsal nerve cord. We have a notochord, and that's where the term chordates comes from. Okay, and the notochord is a rod of cartilage that runs along the dorsal length of the body. In us, ours eventually becomes our backbone, our vertebrae. But in other chordates, so there's 2 other subphyla that are not vertebrates. They are invertebrate chordates. And so they have remnants of this notochord instead of having a vertebral column. And the third thing is gill slits in the pharynx or throat region. So we do actually have gill slits, but they become eustachian tubes as we develop further. So the exception are the two groups that are invertebrates, and they include the tunicates and the lanceolets. And like I said, they are invertebrates because they don't have a vertebral column. Instead, the notochord remains in a certain region in them. But they do have the three characteristics, so they are considered within the same phylum. In terms of body temperature, chordates are either homeotherms or poikilotherms. So homeotherm is just another name for endotherms or warm-blooded organisms, and that just means that we can maintain our own body temperature. So if the temperature gets colder, then we'll burn more food stuff. We'll break down more things in order to release heat on the inside, and that helps us to keep a fairly constant temperature on the inside. Okay, poikilotherms, on the other hand, are cold-blooded. They are ectotherms, and so their body temperature depends on the temperature of the environment around them. So if it gets cold, then they have to go and try and find some source of heat in order to warm up. So they have to go sun themselves, or they have to move to a warmer area. If they get hot, then they have to do the opposite. They need to maybe go and find some water to cool off in, or some shade, so they don't overheat. So this is, as we're going through, we know that all chordates have bilateral symmetry. They are triploblastic, and they are coelomates. Okay, but we're going to look at them in terms of their body temperature. Okay, are they homeotherms or are they poikilotherms? Are they warm-blooded or cold-blooded, for instance? Then we're going to look at how they breathe. Okay, so chordate respiration, some of them breathe using gills, which are outgrowths that have fine surfaces that allow diffusion of gases across them. Usually if they have gills, then they live in water. Okay. They can breathe using diffusion, so they may have diffusion of gases right through their skin. So oxygen would come in, carbon dioxide would go out, and they'd have lots of blood vessels on the inside of their skin. Or they may use lungs, and lungs are just like what we have. They're internal organs that are used to bring oxygen in and to remove carbon dioxide, and they usually do that forcefully. In terms of circulation, we're also going to look in general. We're not going to look at specific blood vessels and things like that for this particular chapter, but we will look at them in terms of how many chambers they have in their heart, and if it's a one-way path or a two-way path, and if there's any mixing of blood. Okay, so mammals and birds and crocodiles, which are the only exception to the reptiles, they all have a four-chambered heart. Amphibians and most reptiles amphibians have a three-chambered heart, and most reptiles have a 3.5-chambered heart. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. And the fishes are not as complex as the rest. They have a two-chambered heart with a one-way path. And this is a diagram like what's in your book to illustrate that. So fishes, we said, have two-chambered heart. So this is the atrium and this is the ventricle. So the blood would come back from their tissues, having used up oxygen. Okay, so it's showing blue, meaning it's got less oxygen, or it's deoxygenated. The heart pumps it out to the gills. Okay, and there's lots of little blood vessels along the gills where they pick up oxygen from the water that's passing over the gills. So then it becomes red because it picked up oxygen. Okay, it gets pumped out to the body tissues, and the body tissues will use up the oxygen, so the deoxygenated blood will go back to the heart, and so it's considered a one-way circulation. So that is circulation for fish. So they have a two-chambered heart, and it's very simple circulation. Out to the gills, out to the tissue, back to the heart. Okay, now this is showing a three-chambered heart. Okay, there's two atria on top, and then there's one ventricle on the bottom. And the green line is showing the difference that would be for most reptiles, all but the crocodiles. So most reptiles have a partially divided ventricle, so they consider it 3.5 chambered heart. Okay. Now the fact that the ventricle is not completely divided means that blood coming back from the tissues and blood coming back from the lungs and skin, or however they breathe, all gets put into the one ventricle. And that means that the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can mix. And so they've colored it purple to show that it mixes. Okay, so what does go out to the body tissues is not going to be as oxygenated as it could be. Okay, so the ventricle pumps the blood. Part of it goes out to their lungs, so that means pulmonary circulation means their lungs, and skin for some organisms, and then it comes back to the heart on the other side. Okay, so some of it goes out to however they breathe, however they get oxygen, so to their lungs and possibly skin, picks up oxygen and it comes back to the left side of the heart oxygenated. Okay, again, it's going to mix in the ventricles. Okay, and then when the ventricle pumps, some of it goes back to the lungs and skin, but some of it goes out to the body tissues. Body tissues use up the oxygen, and so deoxygenated blood comes back to the right side of the heart. So there's two pathways. Okay, there's the systemic loop, so it goes out to the body tissues and back, and there's a pulmonary loop. Pulmonary circulation goes out to the lungs and skin and back. So there's two pathways, but there is some mixing allowed here. This is showing circulation in mammals and in birds. Okay, in mammals and birds, they have a fully divided ventricle. Okay, so it's kind of like we have a dual pump. We have two pathways, but it's completely separated so that the blood coming back from the tissues, which is deoxygenated, and the blood coming back from the lungs, which is oxygenated, they can't mix. So the blood that goes out to the tissues has a higher level of oxygen than it would if it was a three-chambered heart. Okay, so the blood comes back from the tissues, it's deoxygenated, so it's blue, comes into the right side of the heart, goes into the atrium, down into the ventricle, and then gets pumped out to the lungs. Okay, pulmonary circulation means out to the lungs, picks up its oxygen, so now it's red to show that it's oxygenated blood. The oxygenated blood comes back into the left side of the heart, into the atrium, down into the ventricle, and then it gets pumped out to all the body tissues. Okay, so because there's no mixing, the blood that goes out to the body tissues has as much oxygen as possibly could. So it's oxygenated, not mixed. And that's really important because birds, especially if they're flying, it's really important that they get the maximum amount of oxygen that they can. And mammals are very active and require a lot of oxygen in order to maintain, for both cases, to maintain their body temperature from the inside. So birds and mammals have 4-chambered hearts. They're also the only ones that are warm-blooded. So they have an extra high demand of oxygen in order to maintain their body temperature too. The other feature that we're going to look at for each is their reproduction. So we know that because they're animals, they all reproduce sexually. Okay, but in this case, we're going to look at their type of fertilization. So is it external, where the egg and the sperm unite outside of the body? Okay, and that includes most fish and amphibians. Or is it internal, where the egg and the sperm unite inside the body? Usually inside the female. There are some exceptions, but that includes reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay, so we're going to look at those features. So, the focus, again, phylum Chordata, it has 3 subphyla. One that includes the tunicates, so they are called subphylum Chordata. Euro means tail, so that is implying or showing, reflecting that where the notochord is still remaining in the tunicates is in their tail region. The lanceolate is the other group, so the subphyla Cephalochordata includes the lanceolates. Cephalo means head, so that means their notochord is still remaining in their head. The third subphylum, which we belong to, is subphylum Vertebrata. Now, depending on what book or which reference you're looking at, you may see different ways that they will write the taxa for the vertebrates, but this is how we're going with. Okay, so in subphylum Vertebrata, there's 2 superclasses. There's superclass Agnatha, so this is kind of a little above, it's below the subphylum, but it's a little above the class. So there's superclass Agnatha, and nath means jaw, so A in front means without. So superclass Agnatha are the jawless fish. And they include the hagfish and the lamprey eel. So this is the lamprey, and this is the hagfish. And the lamprey is an external parasite, and they cause a lot of issues with the fishing industry. So this is, I think it's on a trout. But they have a really powerful sucker-like mouth with a rasping tongue. And these are their gill slits along the side and their eye. We have one that I'll probably show you in class. The other superclass are the ones with jaws. So superclass Gnathostomata. Gnatho means jaw and stomata means mouth. So they're the jawed chordates. So that's the superclass that we belong to, as well as the other jawed vertebrates. So we're going to take a look at these 6 classes of vertebrates. So each of you, in some groups, have dissected or taken a closer look at one of these 6 classes, and so you're going to share in class, and hopefully we'll do it other years too, but this year at least we've done a dissection for a representative for each so that we can share and talk about their key features. Okay, so the first 2 classes are fish. Ichthyes means fish. The first one is chondrichthyes, and chond means cartilage. So they are the cartilaginous fish, and so their skeleton is made up of only cartilage. There's no bone in their skeleton, and they include sharks, skates, and rays. Ostei, if you think, you've probably heard of osteoporosis, and that means porous bones. It's an illness where they have pores or holes that are in their bones and they break easily. So ostei means bones. So Osteichthyes is the bony fish. Then we have the amphibians, so class Amphibia, class Reptilia, class Aves, and class Mammalia. So again, if you can think of a representative from each group, then you'll remember their features a little better. First one we're going to highlight is class Chondrichthyes, and we said already that ichthyes means fish and chondr means cartilage, so they're known as the cartilaginous fish. The skeleton's made of cartilage instead of bone. Now, they include the skates, rays, and sharks. And if you were looking at skates and rays, their gill slits are on the bottom, on the ventral surface, whereas the sharks are along the side. And if you were to look at the dogfish that's dissected, you can easily see the gill slits along the sides. And if you remember back when we did the dichotomous key activity, we looked at some different ones and trying to identify what family they belong to. Okay, you can see their gill slits. There's no special cover to protect them and cover them. And if you were to rub them, if you were to run your hand along them, then they have tiny little scales that almost feel like sandpaper. They're called placoid scales, and they're a little bit rough. So, sorry. Some unique features that they have a lateral line, and so do most of the Osteichthyes fish, but the lateral line is a special sensory function, and it gives them the ability to detect motion and movement in the water. Okay, so key things that make them belong. I'm just gonna make sure I didn't. Oh, this is from the dissection part. Okay, so there are certain things in the dissection that they're going to be pointing out to you that you can include in here. So obviously, some of the things are a little more obvious than others. The fact that they have gill slits means they breathe using gills, right? So if we were to take a look at this, and we'll do it for the first group together. Their common name is cartilaginous fish. The representatives would include sharks, skates, and rays. Some key features about them: their skeleton is made of cartilage. They have no bone, in other words. They have 5 to 7 gill slits that you can see. They have rough scales. And in order to keep their level in the body of water, they just keep swimming, but some of them will actually produce oils. So if you looked at the dogfish, then the people who dissect it would tell you that the liver was very oily, and probably there was some oil inside of the body. Okay, so the oils are produced in order to try and make them more buoyant, or able to float better. Integument means skin. Okay, so are there special features on their skin? And so they have rough scales. That's good enough for our level. We don't have to talk about the name of them. I already mentioned it, but I don't expect you to know that. So in terms of their body temperature, as mentioned earlier, the only ones that are endotherms or homeotherms, or can maintain their own body temperature from inside, are birds and mammals. Okay, so if you can remember, they're the only ones that are homeotherms, then the rest must be poikilotherms. Okay, so fish, amphibians, reptiles, all of them are ectotherms or poikilotherms, or cold-blooded. Okay, circulatory system. we highlighted about the number of chambers of their heart. So they have a 2-chambered heart, like other fishes, and it has one pathway. So it goes from the heart to the gills to the body tissues back to the heart. Respiration, how do they breathe? They have gill slits so that they can breathe using their gills. Reproduction, most is external, but sharks are unique to the fishes in that they have internal fertilization. And if you saw the male dogfish, then you would have seen its claspers, which are modifications on their anal fins that allow them to deposit sperm in the female. Okay? So they would develop inside and then be born as live young. Anything extra to note? They have to keep swimming all the time in order to maintain their level in the water. They have the lateral line. Let's see, were there other features on here that we would include? They had a really cool intestine that has a spiral valve in it. No, I think we've mentioned pretty much everything else. Okay, so you could tell whether a shark is male or female from external features. If they have the claspers, they're male. If they don't, then they're female. And that's probably about it for class Chordates. We may add a couple other things in class, but that covers the main. Okay, so now we'll move on to class 2, Osteichthyes. So ichthyes again means fish. Oste refers to bone. So they are the bony fish. And so this is the actual class that's the most numerous of all of the vertebrates. Okay, so that is in terms of classes. So there's so many different kinds of bony fish. Their skeletons are made of bone. One quick way that you can tell if it's a bony fish or a cartilaginous fish is to look and see if you can see gill slits. Okay, these ones, bony fish, have a special bony covering that covers and protects their gill slits. So it's called the operculum. So you should know about the operculum. So if you picture looking in the aquarium at your goldfish, then you could see this moving in and out as they're breathing. Okay, because they're pushing water out past their gill slits, and it goes in and out. So this is the operculum right here. And so in these, pretty easy to tell, you can't see their gill slits. If you were to run your hand along them, then they'd feel pretty smooth as opposed to feeling like little bits of sandpaper. So they have smooth types of scales. And some neat facts about their scales. I'm not sure if it's true for all fish, but a lot of fish, you can tell their age, kind of like the rings on a tree. They have rings on their scales. So you could count the rings on their scales. I never knew that, which is kind of cool. Another unique feature for the bony fish is that they have swim bladders. And the swim bladders allow them to go up and down in the water column. So this is for a lot of bony fish. Not all of them have it. If they quickly go between different levels, then the swim bladder would kind of slow them down. So if they are fast movers and they go like from really high to really low, then they probably wouldn't have a swim bladder. Instead, they would probably have other things like producing oils and other things to help them stay buoyant. But it would waste time to have to regulate the amount of gas that's in the swim bladder in order to go between the levels. So bony fish include a lot of the ones that we tend to eat. So herring, trout, cod, perch, all of them. And there's a couple little video clips that I'll include that you can watch about some different bony fish. So they're linked on the class website. They'll also be linked in Edmodo. Yeah. Their fertilization is external, and they breathe using gills again. Third class are the amphibians. So class Amphibia, which stands for dual life, and they're referred to as having dual life because they spend part of their life in water and part of their life on land. Their early form is fish-like. So if you think of a tadpole, it is fish-like. So they breathe using gills. They have a 2-chambered heart. They eat different things than the adult form. So there's less competition between their body forms. And they go through a process called metamorphosis. Okay, so they are very different in their early forms from their late forms. The adults, on the other hand, are air breathers, and they actually use their skin and their lungs. So if you were to try and pick up a frog, then a lot of times they'll slip out of your hand because they have to keep their skin moist, and so they have a very slippery feeling, smooth and slippery feeling skin. Toads are a little bit different. They spend a little more time on land, and they have a drier, scalier skin. Not scaly, but bumpy. But frogs and salamanders tend to have a really moist skin because they're breathing through their skin. In order to breathe through their mouth, they don't have a diaphragm to help pull in the air, so they close their mouth and they pull in the air through their nostril, and then they move their floor of their mouth up and down in order to force the air back and forth into their lungs. So the gases are exchanged across their mouth and their lungs. Okay, so that's how they breathe. Reproduction for them is external, but they have a special process that they tend to do, frogs at least, to try and maximize the chance of fertilization. So for frogs, the male piggybacks the female, and he has swollen thumb pads in order to push the eggs out of the female, and he'll deposit his sperm on top of them. So it's external fertilization, but they undergo a special process called amplexus in order to increase the chances of fertilization. So that's kind of a cool feature of them. These guys are also cold-blooded. And any other neat things about them? They swallow, frogs swallow their food whole. So if you noticed, they have a really wide opening at the back of their mouth, and you could see the orbits for their eyes in the roof of their mouth. And so when they're swallowing, it's really cool, and I'll include videos for this too, but they swallow, they don't swallow like us, because they can't, but they're swallowing things whole, and they need a way of pushing it back, so their eyes go down into their mouth, which is really cool. And for some species, if they take in something that's not so good, or it's gives them a bad taste, or they're not feeling well, it's really cool what they can do. So you should watch a little video clip on it, but they can throw up their stomach and clean it off and then swallow it back down again. So if you ever have a pet frog and it does that, don't be alarmed, because it's just cleaning its stomach. This is showing the life cycle of the frog. Okay, so it starts out with eggs and sperm. You can't have fertilization without the sperm. Fertilization happens, so this diagram isn't quite complete, But when fertilization happens, we get a zygote, starts dividing and forms an embryo. And then the embryo will go through a series of changes to get to the adult form. So we have the early tadpole form. And so a tadpole is very fish-like. It has a two-chambered heart. It has a tail. It has gills for breathing. And as it develops, the hind limbs will form first, and the tail will start to be reabsorbed near the end. The forelimbs will start to form. It will start to be able to go on to land and assume pulmonary breathing, so that means lung breathing. And it's still breathing through their skin, too. And the tail will be fully reabsorbed to give the adult frog. Okay, there's a video for that as well, so we'll include that on the website. The next the next class is on class Reptilia, which are the reptiles. These organisms have better developed lungs with the rib cage. They have a thick, scaly, waterproof skin that's made from keratin. And keratin is a special protein that a lot of our skin structures are made from. So, for instance, our hair is made of keratin. Our fingernails are made of keratin. So, for reptiles, their scaly skin is made of keratin. And it helps to prevent water loss. A lot of them tend to live where there's lots of sun and warmth because they are cold-blooded, and they rely on outside, whatever's around them, to adjust their temperature inside. So again, you've probably seen lots of shows where they might be sunning themselves on a rock, or they have to go and shade themselves. It just depends on what the temperature is around them, and they have to adjust where they're at in order to adjust their temperature inside. They have to shed their skin several times a year, so they molt. Okay. And they lay a leathery amniotic egg in order to prevent their young from drying out. They're not born in the water like other organisms earlier than them or more primitive to them. They include lizards, snakes, crocodiles, alligators, and turtles. While the adult amphibians had a 3-chambered heart, the reptiles have the 3.5-chambered heart. Okay, so the ventricle is partially divided. Now the exception is the crocodile, and the crocodile has a 4-chambered heart. Some really amazing features of snakes. An anaconda can swallow something as big as a hippo, or a deer. So there's some videos you can watch that just show how amazing they are, that they can swallow something so big. An anaconda, if it swallows a hippo, then it would only have to have one feeding for that year, for instance, but it would take a long time to break it down and digest it. For it to be able to do that, it has to have special adaptations. So there's a video clip that you can watch that highlights these things, but their skull can actually separate both sideways and up and down. Okay, so their jaw can be open really wide, but their skull can also separate to the sides so that it can accommodate something that large. They can also take their trachea, which is their windpipe for breathing, and stick it out. So one of the videos you can kind of see it sticking out underneath whatever they're eating. So they can still breathe while whatever it is that they're swallowing is going down. Some other features. Anything I'm missing? In order for them to lay eggs that have babies inside, then fertilization has to be internal. Okay, so they're the first group to have internal fertilization, except for a few exceptions along the way. But of the classes of vertebrates, they're the first to have internal fertilization. Okay, so birds. This is class aves. Aves means birds. The most obvious thing for birds is that they are the only group to have feathers and wings. Well, not the only ones to have wings, because we have bats, for instance, who have modified appendages that act like wings, but they have wings and feathers. And feathers are really modified scales from earlier ancestors, so modified scales of reptiles. They have hollow bones, so these are all features that allow them or give them adaptations for flight. They have hollow bones to make them lighter. They have a large sternum, which is the big breastbone down the middle, for attachment of muscles, the big flight muscles. They have air sacs as well as lungs for more efficient breathing. They produce a hard-shelled amniotic egg, usually more than one. Okay, they have no teeth, so their beaks are modified according to what food type they have, and then they have a crop and a gizzard, like what we saw in the earthworm. So they take in little stones, and that helps for the gizzard to mash the food stuff against the little stones to help break it down mechanically. Okay, so they are the only other class to have a 4-chambered heart, and they have internal fertilization, again, because they lay eggs that have babies inside of them. They have to have internal fertilization before the egg coat is produced. Okay, the hard shell before it comes out of the bird. The males are typically brighter colored, and they undergo a special courting ritual for mating to occur. And depends on which species you're talking about, which one will kind of look after the nest and feeding the babies and so forth. So they have internal fertilization, and they have pretty amazing courtship behavior. And there's a few links of their courtship behavior, which is pretty cool. The last class that we're going to talk about is our own. So, class Mammalia, which we call mammals every day. We are called mammals because of the fact that we have mammary glands for producing milk to feed our young. There are other features that we have in common with other mammals. For instance, we have hair. Some organisms have hair all over them. Some it's really thick, some it's very thin, some there's more in certain parts. Okay, but we do have hair. We have a diaphragm, which is that special muscle that's found along the lower part of your rib cage. It kind of cuts you across in the middle. But it's used for us to breathe, so it helps our lungs to take in air and force it out. We have sweat glands. Okay, we are heterodonts. So that means that we have different types of teeth. So we have 4 different types of teeth, and depending on the mammal, you might have really big canines if you eat raw meat. Okay, so tigers and lions and even dogs have bigger canines. Or you might have really big front incisors if you cut things a lot. So horses, for instance, have really big incisors in the front because they cut grass. Okay, they're great to have on your lawn. Most mammals give birth to live young, but there are 3 groups. So we do have some egg-laying mammals. So there's monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals. There's marsupials, which lay live young that develop in pouches. And then there's placental mammals. And I think I have a slide that will talk about those a little bit more. Most live on land, but we do have a couple of aquatic types. So there's whales and dolphins, which are aquatic mammals. They include everything from bears to kangaroos to humans to bats. Okay. And the last, I should talk about the other things first, but it's not written on here, but we did talk about it earlier in an earlier slide. But again, birds and mammals are the only ones that have a 4-chambered heart, and we are homeotherms, or we're endotherms, you could call them too. We're warm-blooded. Okay. Fertilization is internal, and then development, it depends on which group. So placental mammals, the fetus is nourished by a placenta during the pregnancy or during gestation. We are placental. Okay. Marsupials, the fetus is nourished by a yolk sac. The embryo is born at a very, very, very early stage, and you can watch the video clips of the kangaroo or the echinida, but they are born really, really tiny, and they crawl into the mother's pouch, and they latch onto one of the nipples, and then they will feed, and they'll come out of the pouch at certain times. Okay, so they include the kangaroo, the koala, and the possum. Monotremes are egg-laying mammals. So the platypus and the echinida, the echinida does have a pouch, but it does lay an egg. So it lays an egg first, and then it gets into the pouch and is carried around in the pouch. Okay, so I think that is about it. This is just some pictures of different mammals in the different groups. Yep. Don't forget to fill in this. It should be a helpful tool for you when you're studying. I'll show you some ways that you can look at it and kind of make it a lot easier to remember things about them and see patterns in the information instead of trying to memorize each column and everything about every group. Okay, so this should be a valuable tool to you as you are reviewing for the test. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask anytime.